We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words from the Declaration of Independence, a document officially throwing off the shackles of monarchy and declaring a new nation, free and independent, were written by Thomas Jefferson, who would become the third President of the United States. He was also, relevant to this discussion, a slave owner, clearly contradicting the values he embodied in that document. It was also an internal contradiction, as he was allegedly opposed to slavery while still not freeing his own slaves. Indeed, in Jefferson's writings, he was explicit in his belief that blacks were inferior to whites. In 1788, he wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia, "Their inferiority is not the effect merely of their condition of life. It is not their conditions, then, but nature, which had produced the distinction." I'll be addressing the complexity of Jefferson's life, words, and actions another time. Today, we're going to talk about modern Southern apologetics, those who would create a mythological past in which the war wasn't about what it actually was about, slavery, and slavery alone. As a word of warning, I will be citing writings with quotes from people living before, during, and after the time of the Civil War. Because of this, language that is today insensitive and culturally offensive will appear only as it did in those writings and statements. Anytime you hear or see such language, please know that it is coming directly from a primary source of the time and not from my own commentary. So grab a cup of coffee and let's get to the bottom of it. It's time to ruminate. John Jay, our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, amplified the blatant contradiction between our Declaration of Independence and the institution of slavery when he said, "It is much to be wished that slavery may be abolished. The honor of the states, as well as justice and humanity, in my opinion, loudly call upon them to emancipate these unhappy people. To contend for our own liberty and to deny that blessing to others involves an inconsistency not to be excused." Though the Declaration made the desire for the freedom from oppression abundantly clear, it was not all-inclusive. About 20% of the population of the colonies were slaves at the time Jefferson penned those immortal words that would not begin to be realized for almost another century, with the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. In fact, Marquis de Lafayette, a French aristocrat who came to our aid in the Revolutionary War, said when it was over, "I would never have drawn my sword in the cause of America if I had conceived that thereby I was founding a land of slavery." Benjamin Franklin, a vehement opponent of slavery, agreed that it was antithetical to the ideas espoused in our own fight for independence. He wrote, "Slavery is so foreign to the human mind that the moral faculties, as well as those of the understanding, are debased and rendered torpid by it. Neither my tongue, nor my pen, nor purse shall be wanting to promote the abolition of what to me appears so inconsistent with humanity and Christianity." Alexander Hamilton joined that opinion by saying, "Who talks most about freedom and equality? Is it not those who hold a Bill of Rights in one hand and a whip for affrighted slaves in the other?" We learn of the Three-Fifths Compromise as our founders fought over slavery and abolition, but even Jefferson secured its future. Civil War historian Henry Winchek, in his book An Imperfect God, George Washington, His Slaves, and the Creation of America, wrote, "The ownership of black people was so profitable, the institution was getting harder and harder to dislodge, especially after Jefferson allowed it in the newly purchased Louisiana Territory. Jefferson was one of the first to realize you could use enslaved people as collateral. He took out a $2,000 slave equity loan in Amsterdam. When this notion spread throughout the South, it was really game over for abolition." Slavery had been extensively debated when the Constitution was drafted, and African Americans ultimately lost by being excluded from our nation's founding ideals as penned by our third president, not even being given the status of full human beings. The institution of slavery was solidified in Southern culture, and the nails were driven in by Jefferson himself. However, abolitionists hung on and continued to fight, and this would ultimately culminate in a civil war, a conflict that very nearly destroyed this grand experiment in its infancy. This eventual culmination was easily predicted by our founders. John Quincy Adams, sixth President of the United States, said, "Slavery is the root of almost all the troubles of the present and fears for the future. If the Union must be dissolved, slavery is precisely the question upon which it ought to break." President Abraham Lincoln left no doubt as to the cause of the war when he wrote, "1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was the cause of the war." It is common to hear modern Southern apologists push forward any number of alleged causes of the Civil War. Most of them attempt to divert it to states' rights, taxation, oppression, economic interest, and only minimally include slavery as one of many causes, desperately trying to shift focus away from it being the primary cause. Still others even try to argue that it wasn't a cause at all. However, in spite of their best efforts, history is what it is. They can attempt to rewrite it to suit a more comfortable narrative, but the facts simply make them look foolish and historically ignorant, often willfully so. So let's step back in time and listen to Southerners themselves before, during, and after the Civil War, how they felt, what they believed, and what they fought for, in their own words. We'll put to rest the words of these modern apologists once and for all. We begin with events leading up to the Civil War. Slavery had been a contested issue between North and South since the country was founded, and inescapably led to the conflict of the Civil War. Many of our founders knew that the issue would be resolved at the original Constitutional Convention, or would surely be finally addressed in a later conflict, when it would either be obliterated or continue to leave its stench and stain upon this nation. Religion had played no small role in slavery since pre-revolutionary colonial America, and here Southern pulpits rose again to declare slavery an institution ordained by God. In his 1823 document, Exposition of the Views of the Baptists Relative to the Colored Population, Reverend James C. Furman wrote, "The result of this inquiry and reasoning on the subject of slavery brings us, sir, if I mistake not, very regularly to the following conclusions: that the holding of slaves is justifiable by the doctrine and example contained in Holy Writ, and is therefore consistent with Christian uprightness, both in sentiment and conduct." Churches themselves participated in the slave trade, evidenced by an ad in the Charleston Courier in 1835. Field Negroes by Thomas Gadsden on Tuesday the 17th will be sold at the north of the Exchange at 10 o'clock, a prime gang of 10 Negroes, accustomed to the culture of cotton and provisions, belonging to the Independent Church in Christ Church Parish. Southern sentiment leading up to the Civil War left no doubt that slavery was their foremost concern, and the reason for which they committed treason and took up arms against their country. Southern politicians had been whipping up a frenzy among their constituents for quite some time, and this began to crescendo with debates over the question of Western expansion and whether or not to admit new territories that allowed slavery into the Union. John C. Calhoun, U.S. Senator from South Carolina, said in a speech on the Senate floor in 1837, "The defense of human liberty against the aggressions of despotic power have always been the most efficient in states where domestic slavery was to prevail." Slavery was a highly contentious issue as the United States continued to expand westward. The South took exception to disallowing slavery in new states admitted to the Union and made this abundantly clear. Albert Gallatin Brown, U.S. Senator from Mississippi, said in 1858, "I want Cuba, I want Tamaulipas, Potosi, and one or two other Mexican states, and I want them all for the same reason, for the planting and spreading of slavery. Yes, I want these countries for the spread of slavery. I would spread the blessings of slavery like the religion of our divine master, to the uttermost ends of the earth, and rebellious and wicked as the Yankees have been, I would even extend it to them." Southern claims as civilized people who were kind to slaves who would otherwise live in horrid conditions were belied by their own actions. One of Calhoun's slaves, whom he had named Aleck, had escaped and was captured. Calhoun wrote in a letter to those who captured Aleck, "I am glad to hear that Aleck has been apprehended, and am much obliged to you for paying the expense of apprehending him. He ran away for no other cause but to avoid a correction for some misconduct, and as I am desirous to prevent a repetition, I wish you to have him lodged in jail for 1 week, to be fed on bread and water, and to employ someone for me to give him 30 lashes well laid on." Mississippi's Hinds County Gazette opined about Western expansion in 1850, "The South ought not to acquiesce in the application of California for admission until the North has consented to an equitable compromise on the slavery question." Alabama's Muskogee Herald in 1856 attached equality to the issue of Western expansion, specifically the necessity of slavery to keep all whites equal to each other. They wrote, "Free society, we sicken at the name. What is it but a conglomeration of greasy mechanics, filthy operatives, small-fisted farmers, and moonstruck theorists? All the northern men, and especially the New England states, are devoid of society fitted for well-bred gentlemen. The prevailing class one meets with is that of mechanics struggling to be genteel, and small farmers who do their own drudgery, and yet are hardly fit for association with a southern gentleman's body servant. This is your free society, with northern hordes are trying to extend into Kansas." Over the next decade, Southern politicians joined a chorus referencing slavery as perhaps not a great thing, but as both necessary and justified, literally referencing it as necessary for equality among white men. It was feared that freeing slaves would elevate them to an equal status with the lowest class whites. Representative Henry Wise from Virginia said, "The principle of slavery is a leveling principle. It is friendly to equality. Break down slavery, and you would with the same blow break down the great democratic principle of equality among men." This feeling was echoed by Georgia Governor Joseph E. Brown when he said, "Among us, the poor white laborer is respected as an equal. His family is treated with kindness, consideration, and respect. He does not belong to the menial class. The Negro is in no sense of the term his equal. He feels and knows this. He belongs to the only true aristocracy, the race of white men." James Henry Hammond, in his well-known Cotton is King speech, echoed the lament of lower-class whites facing equality to freed slaves, saying, "There is no starvation, no begging, no want of employment among our people, and not too much employment either. We do not think that whites should be slaves either by law or necessity. Our slaves are black, of another and inferior race. The status in which we have placed them is an elevation. They are elevated from the condition in which God first created them, by being made our slaves. None of that race on the whole face of the globe can be compared with the slaves of the South. They are happy, content, unaspiring, and utterly incapable, from intellectual weakness, ever to give us any trouble by their aspirations. Yours are white, of your own race. You are brothers of one blood. They are your equals in natural endowment of intellect, and they feel galled by their degradation. Once free, blacks would become equal to at least the lowest of whites. There they could compete for the same jobs, opportunities, and even romantic pursuits. In fact, Jefferson Davis, future president of the Confederate States, spoke to their belief that slavery kept white men equal when he said, "You too know that among us white men have an equality resulting from a presence of a lower caste, which cannot exist where white men fill the position here occupied by the servile race. The mechanic who comes among us, employing the less intellectual labor of the African, takes the position which only a master workman occupies, where all the mechanics are white, and therefore it is that our mechanics hold their position of absolute equality among us." In 1856, the Richmond Enquirer ran an editorial saying the same thing. Democratic liberty exists solely because we have slaves. Freedom is not possible without slavery. Christianity in the South continued to promote slavery both politically and among parishioners. Texas's article of secession used divine justification, stating that in this free government all white men are and of right ought to be entitled to equal civil and political rights, that the servitude of the African race, as existing in these states, is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind, and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator as recognized by all Christian nations, while the destruction of the existing relations between the two races, as advocated by our sectional enemies, would bring inevitable calamities upon both and desolation upon the 15 slave-holding states. Frederick Douglass spoke to religious justification being used for slavery in 1846, as published in a book of speeches given by American abolitionists in Edinburgh, when he said, "I have found it difficult to speak on this matter without persons coming forward and saying, 'Douglass, are you not afraid of injuring the cause of Christ? You do not desire to do so, we know, but are you not undermining religion?' This has been said to me again and again, even since I came to this country. The church and the slave prison stand next to each other. The groans and cries of the heartbroken slave are often drowned in the pious devotions of his religious master. The church-going bell and the auctioneer's bell chime in with each other. The pulpit and the auctioneer's block stand in the same neighborhood, while the blood-stained gold goes to support the pulpit. The pulpit covers the infernal business with the garb of Christianity. We have men sold to build churches, women sold to support missionaries, and babies sold to buy Bibles and communion services for the churches. Not only are legacies left and slaves sold in this way to build churches, but the right is openly defended by the church. In 1836, the great Methodist Church in America, holding through ministers and elders and members in their own church 250,000 slaves, said in their general conference in Cincinnati that they had no right, no wish, no intention to interfere with the relation of master and slave as it existed in the slave states of the American Union. What was this but saying to the world, we have no right, no wish, no intention to release the bondman from his chains? The annual conference in the South took the broad ground of the right of property in man, asserting it in a resolution, proclaiming it in an address, preaching it in Thanksgiving sermons, putting it forth in Fourth of July orations, and even quoting Scripture. So boldly had Southerners come to see slavery as ordained by God that they felt blessed by it. The Atlanta Confederacy wrote in 1860, "We regard every man in our midst an enemy to the institutions of the South who does not boldly declare that he believes African slavery to be a social, moral, and political blessing. Echoing the belief that slavery was necessary to civilization itself, Virginia Senator Robert M.T. Hunter said in 1852, "There is not a respectable system of civilization known to history whose foundations were not laid in the institution of domestic slavery." In fact, amplifying Hunter's words, soon-to-be Confederate General Robert E. Lee wrote to his wife in 1856, "In this enlightened age, there are few, I believe, but what will acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country. It is useless to expatiate on its disadvantages. I think it, however, a greater evil to the white man than to the black race, and while my feelings are strongly enlisted in behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more strong for the former. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise, merciful providence." Calhoun took to the Senate floor with the intention of rejecting the notion of slavery being a necessary evil, and sending to the ash heap any thought of slavery being negative in the least, instead calling it a positive good. He said, "I take higher ground. I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, the relation now existing in the slave-holding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good. I may say with truth that in few countries so much is left to the share of the laborer, and so little exacted from him, or where there is more kind attention paid to him in sickness or infirmities of age. Compare his condition with the tenants of the poorhouses in the more civilized portions of Europe." U.S. Representative Lawrence Kite would echo the belief that slavery was morally correct when he later argued, "African slavery is the cornerstone of the industrial, social, and political fabric of the South, and whatever wars against it, wars against her very existence. Strike down the institution of African slavery, and you reduce the South to depopulation and barbarism. The anti-slavery party contend that slavery is wrong in itself, and the government is a consolidated national democracy. We of the South contend that slavery is right, and that this is a Confederate republic of sovereign states." Southern influencers and politicians began to attach slavery to political fortunes. Accept it and prosper, or reject it and find your end in the political world, and perhaps in the world, period. Georgia politician and later Confederate General Henry L. Benning said in 1849, "First, then, it is apparent, horribly apparent, that the slavery question rides insolently over every other, everywhere. In fact, that is the only question which in the least affects the results of the elections." Newspapers all over the South rose to the occasion to propagandize for politicians and religious leaders and push the cause of a coming war. Notions of leaving the Union had begun to dance in the minds of some Southerners before the election, even only months before, when U.S. Representative Alfred P. Aldrich from South Carolina said, "If the Republican Party, with its platform of principles, the main feature of which is the abolition of slavery and, therefore, the destruction of the South, carries the country at the next presidential election, shall we remain in the Union or form a separate confederacy? This is the great, grave issue. It is not who shall be president, it is not which party shall rule, it is a question of political and social existence." Calhoun did correctly predict the inevitable war that would come over slavery. Speaking to the Compromise of 1850, he said, "I fix its probable occurrence within 12 years or 3 presidential terms. You and others of your age will probably live to see it. I shall not. The mode by which it will be done is not so clear. It may be brought about in a manner that no one now foresees, but the probability is it will explode in a presidential election." This is precisely what happened following the election of Abraham Lincoln 10 years later in 1860. The election of Lincoln was a galvanizing force for the South, and the thunder for war began to grow louder. In a letter to Kentucky Governor Beriah Magoffin in 1860, Stephen F. Hale, Commissioner of Alabama to the state of Kentucky, wrote, "The election of Mr. Lincoln is hailed not simply as a change of administration, but as the inauguration of new principles and a new theory of government, and even as the downfall of slavery. Therefore it is that the election of Mr. Lincoln cannot be regarded otherwise than a solemn declaration, on the part of a great majority of the Northern people, of hostility to the South, her property, and her institutions, nothing less than an open declaration of war." Some were ready to go to war immediately following Lincoln's election. U.S. Representative Henry Hilliard from Alabama, speaking of the institution of slavery, said in 1860, "I am for offering battle at once. I am for staking everything upon a single field. We shall never be in better condition for contesting it than we are now. And if we are hereafter to struggle for a foothold in desert and New Mexico, I prefer to struggle for ascendancy in California too, that we may bear our institutions with us to the Pacific coast." In letter to the citizens of the Greenville District in 1860, Reverend James C. Furman struck out against abolitionism when he wrote, "Every Negro in South Carolina and every Southern state will be his own master, nay, more than that, will be the equal of every one of you. If you are tame enough to submit, abolition preachers will be at hand to consummate the marriage of your daughters to black husbands." Representative Kite, earlier proposing slavery as a moral good, also felt that secession was the only answer. He said, "We have seen, too, that the Northern majority will use the power of the Union to destroy slavery. I have no hope of a review of the federal Constitution and its amendment so as to secure the safety of the South. What then? I say frankly that, in my judgment, disunion is the only remedy left to us against the dangers which menace our very existence." So strong was Kite's conviction as to the cause of disunion being about slavery that he continued, "Our people have come to this on the question of slavery. I am willing, in that address, to rest it upon that question. I think it is the great central point from which we are now proceeding, and I am not willing to divert the public attention from it." The drums had been beating since colonial times, and only grew louder in Southern political and religious circles in the years following the American Revolution and leading up to the Civil War. Southern propaganda now promoted slavery as a moral good, necessary for the equality of free white men, ordained by God as justified and righteous. Finally, when a president was elected who would take action to sever the ties of the United States with slavery, the South decided it was time to sever ties with the United States. The stage was set, and articles of secession soon followed. South Carolina's slave population in 1860 numbered about 412,000, actually larger than the white population. On December 24, 1860, their declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the Federal Union made clear that they were leaving the United States for one purpose alone, slavery. The secession article stated, "A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. He is to be entrusted with the administration of the common government because he has declared that government cannot endure permanently half slave, half free, and that the public mind must rest in the belief that slavery is in the course of ultimate extinction." On January 2, 1861, the people of Georgia, with about 466,000 slaves, went to the polls to select delegates to a secession convention. On March 23, 1861, the convention issued a declaration of secession, including the following: "The people of Georgia, having dissolved their political connection with the government of the United States of America, present to their confederates and the world the causes which have led to the separation. For the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slave-holding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. Florida Convention delegates met on January 3, 1861. Of the 60 attendees, 51 owned slaves. They voted to secede on January 10th, calling themselves the Nation of Florida, until finally joining the Confederacy. With a population of 140,400 residents, the state had about 62,000 slaves. They were clear that slavery, their property, was the driving force behind their secession, stating in the article, "At the South, and with our people, of course, slavery is the element of all value, and a destruction of that destroys all that is property." George Williamson, commissioner from Louisiana to the Texas Secession Convention 1 month later, reinforced that the purpose of secession was to maintain slavery when he informed the Texas Convention, "Louisiana looks to the formation of a Southern Confederacy to preserve the blessings of African slavery." Mississippi's population of over 791,000 in 1860, with over 400,000 slaves, held a secession convention and left the United States on January 9, 1861. Again, slavery was their motivating issue, overtly stating in the article, "In the momentous step which our state has taken of dissolving its connection with the government of which we so long formed a part, it is but just that we should declare the prominent reasons which have induced our course. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization." A newspaper in Mississippi, the Mississippi Free Trader, ran the following in an editorial after secession: "But the era of open resistance has dawned upon us. We now openly and fearlessly justify Negro slavery as right and just in the sight of heaven, agreeable to the dictates and awards of divine providence, and as salutary a dispensation to the enslaved race in consideration of their natural and moral inferiority as to the dominant race who are called upon by God himself to protect, feed, clothe, and employ those who cannot take and never have taken so good care of themselves as the slave owners have done for them. Slavery is far better for the Negro race than emancipation." On January 26, 1861, Louisiana adopted its Articles of Secession and joined the Confederacy. Of a population totaling 708,000, almost 300,000 were slaves. They also made very clear that the war and purpose of the South was about slavery alone, stating, "The people of the slave-holding states are bound together by the same necessity and determination to preserve African slavery." Alabama seceded in January 1861 and joined the Confederacy on March 13th. Of a total population of over 964,000, about 435,000 were slaves. Their article of secession stated the following: "And as it is the desire and purpose of the people of Alabama to meet the slave-holding states of the South who may approve such purpose, in order to frame a provisional as well as permanent government upon the principles of the Constitution of the United States." In an address to the citizens of Alabama on the Constitution and laws of the Confederate States of America, Alabama politician Robert Hardy Smith left no doubt as to the reason for disunion, saying, "We have dissolved the late Union, chiefly because of the Negro quarrel. Now, is there any man who wished to reproduce that strife among ourselves, and yet does not he, who wished the slave trade left for the action of Congress, see that he proposed to open a Pandora's box among us and to cause our political arena again to resound with this discussion? Had we left the question unsettled, we should, in my opinion, have sown broadcast the seeds of discord and death in our Constitution. I congratulate the country that the strife has been put to rest forever, and that American slavery is to stand before the world as it is, and on its own merits. We have now placed our domestic institution and secured its rights unmistakably in the Constitution. We have sought by no euphony to hide its name. We have called our Negroes slaves, and we have recognized and protected them as persons and our rights to them as property. Texas voted to secede on February 1st, 1861, with 166 voting for it and 8 voting against. With a population of 604,000, about 183,000 were slaves. Their purpose was to express the superiority of the white race and the necessity to maintain slavery, stating in their secession article a declaration of the causes which impel the state of Texas to secede from the federal union, that Texas was received into the Confederacy as a commonwealth holding, maintaining, and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that had existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, and which her people intended should exist in all future time. Her institutions and geographical position established the strongest ties between her and other slaveholding states of the Confederacy. Those ties have been strengthened by association. But what has been the course of the government of the United States and of the people and authorities of the non-slaveholding states since our connection with them? We hold as undeniable truths that the governments of the various states and of the Confederacy itself were established exclusively by the white race, for themselves and their posterity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment, that they were rightfully held and regarded as an inferior and dependent race, and in that condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable. The population of Virginia in 1860 consisted of 550,000 enslaved black people. On February 13, 1861, Virginia held a convention consisting of 152 delegates picked by Virginia voters to determine whether or not they should secede. The vast majority of those attending were initially anti-secession. However, when the Union lost Fort Sumter on April 13th, the tide turned and the convention voted on April 17th to leave the Union. 1 month later, on May 23rd, Virginia officially joined the Confederacy. Their official article of secession stated, "The people of Virginia, in their ratification of the Constitution of the United States of America, adopted by them in convention on the 25th day of June, in the year of our Lord 1788, having declared that the powers granted under the said Constitution were derived from the people of the United States, and might be resumed whensoever the same should be perverted to their injury and oppression, and the federal government, having perverted said powers, not only to the injury of the people of Virginia, but to the oppression of the southern slave-holding states." With the formation of the Confederate States of America, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens delivered his cornerstone speech at the Athenaeum in Savannah, Georgia in 1861, in which he promoted slavery as the cause of secession and the creation of the Confederacy, stating, "The new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery, as it exists amongst us, the proper status of the Negro and form of civilization." This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. Our new government's foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Taking a stand in opposition to their arguments about states' rights, the Confederate Constitution suddenly didn't leave to their states the right to determine at any point in the future anything other than to support slave ownership. The new Constitution of the Confederate States of America included, "The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states, and shall have the right of transit and sojourn in any state of this Confederacy, with their slaves and other property, and the right of property in said slaves shall not be thereby impaired. No slave or other person held to service or labor in any state or territory of the Confederate States under the laws thereof, escaping or lawfully carried into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such slave belongs, or to whom such service or labor may be due. In all such territory, the institution of Negro slavery as it now exists in the Confederate States shall be recognized and protected by Congress and by the territorial government, and the inhabitants of the several Confederate States and territories shall have the right to take to such territory any slaves lawfully held by them in any of the states or territories of the Confederate States. Georgia's state constitution prevented any future legislators from eliminating slavery in that state, writing into law, "The General Assembly shall have no power to pass laws for the emancipation of slaves." Alabama's state constitution did the same with the following: "No slave in this state shall be emancipated by any act done to take effect in this state or any other country." With the secessions and formation of the Confederate States of America, war was officially declared and the fighting had already begun, and Southern churches were leading the charge. Religious leaders across the South took to their pulpits in force after the first shots were fired to make sure parishioners knew that their cause was just and right in the eyes of God. In his 1861 sermon, "The Glory of God, the Defense of the South," Methodist Reverend John T. Whiteman declared, "The triumphs of Christianity rest this very hour upon slavery, and slavery depends on the triumphs of the South. This war is the servant of slavery." Things got downright prophetic with pastors suddenly becoming seers. On his deathbed, Virginia Episcopal Bishop William Meade said to Robert E. Lee, "I see it now as I have never seen it before. You are at the head of a mighty army to which millions look with untold anxiety and hope. You are a Christian soldier. God thus far owns and blesses you in your efforts for the cause of the South. Trust in God, General Lee, with all your heart. You will never be overcome. You can never be overcome." Preachers even extolled slavery as a proper method for leading savages to salvation. In his sermon, titled "Our Cause in Harmony with the Purposes of God in Christ Jesus," Episcopal Bishop Stephen Elliott said critics of slavery should consider whether, by their interference with this institution, they may not be checking and impeding a work which is manifestly providential. For nearly 100 years, the English and American churches have been striving to civilize and Christianize Western Africa. Thousands, nay, I may say millions, who have learned the way to heaven and who have been made to know their Savior through the means of African slavery. These considerations satisfy me with their condition and assure me that it is the best relation they can, for the present, be made to occupy. Following on these messages, newspapers carried the message far and wide. Recall the words in 1861, cited earlier, from Mississippi Free Trader. "We now openly and fearlessly justify Negro slavery as right and just in the sight of heaven, agreeable to the dictates and awards of divine providence, and as salutary a dispensation to the enslaved race in consideration of their natural and moral inferiority, as to the dominant race who are called upon by God Himself to protect, feed, clothe, and employ those who cannot take and have never taken so good care of themselves, as the slave owners have done for them. Slavery is far better for the Negro race than emancipation." These papers, always a reflection of local sentiment, had no doubt as to what the war was about. Richmond's Southern Punch wrote in 1864, also making note at that time the "other issues" modern Southern apologists often reference. "We are fighting for independence, that our great and necessary domestic institution of slavery shall be preserved, and for the preservation of other institutions of which slavery is the groundwork." And what about those actually fighting the war, the soldier and commanders on the battlefield? They weren't unaware that slavery was what brought them to risk and many to actually sacrifice their lives. This is a soldier from the 28th Wisconsin Infantry, called into the service of the United States against the Confederacy on October 14, 1862. They ultimately lost 240 men. Another soldier with that unit, James B. Lockney, wrote in his diary a year later in 1863, "Last night I talked a while to those men who came in day before yesterday from the southwest part of the state, about 120 miles distant. Many of them wished slavery abolished and slaves out of the country, as they said it was the cause of the war, and the curse of our country and the foe of the body of the people, the poor whites. They knew the slave masters got up the war expressly in the interests of the institution and with no real cause from the government or the North. Even soldiers from the North, knowing slavery to be the cause, were willing to fight to dismantle the horrible institution. Here is a Union soldier from the 19th Michigan Infantry, called into U.S. service on September 25, 1862. Another in that unit, First Sergeant Phineas Hager, wrote in a letter to his wife in 1864, "The more I learn of the cursed institution of slavery, the more I feel willing to endure for its final destruction." But just as Northern soldiers knew the cause and fought, Southern soldiers were also well aware of the reason and proud to fight for it. Southern Virginia Cavalry Colonel John Singleton Mosby said, "I am not ashamed that my family were slaveholders. It was our inheritance. Neither am I ashamed that my ancestors were pirates and cattle thieves. The South went to war on account of slavery. South Carolina went to war, as she said in her secession proclamation, because slavery would not be secure under Lincoln." Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, talking to a slave forced to fight for the Confederacy, said to him, "This fight is against slavery. If we lose it, you will be made free. If we whip the fight and you stay with me and be good boys, I will set you free." And indeed they did lose the fight as the Emancipation Proclamation was solidified and slaves were freed. But the sentiment that brought the South to war remained firmly entrenched. On April 9, 1865, the fate of the South became evident with the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee to United States General Ulysses S. Grant. Lee's subordinates in other areas, getting news over the next months of his surrender and the Confederacy's fall, surrendered as well one by one. But even when the war had come to an end with these surrenders, and in the following years when Reconstruction took place, even into Jim Crow laws being passed as Southern states were readmitted to the United States and they were attempting to maintain slavery in a different, suppressive form, all knew what the whole conflict had been about. In fact, Southern politicians continued to carry the message forward, even into 1904, when Mississippi Senator John Sharp Williams said, "The thing for which we fought was the supremacy of the white man's civilization in the country which he proudly claimed his own, in the land which the Lord his God had given him, founded upon the white man's code of ethics, in sympathy with the white man's traditions and ideals." Colonel Mosby wrote in a 1907 letter to Dr. Aristides Montero, the surgeon who had served under him during the Civil War, "I've always understood that we went to war on account of the thing we quarreled with the North about. I've never heard any other cause than slavery." Even in 1931, Florida Democratic Senator Duncan Fletcher, promoting the lost cause, said the South fought to preserve race integrity. Did we lose that? We fought to maintain free white dominion. Did we lose that? We did not lose that. I submit that what is called the lost cause was not so much lost as is sometimes supposed. Newspapers continued the anti-black sentiment, now attacking those who were freed and daring to enter professions. Ida B. Wells was a pioneering black journalist who wrote for the Free Speech and Headlight. She wrote editorials condemning lynching and calling those doing it murderers. In 1892, the Commercial Appeal in Tennessee said of her, "Those Negroes who are attempting to make the lynching of individuals of their race a means for arousing the worst passions of their kind are playing with a dangerous sentiment. The fact that a black scoundrel is allowed to live and utter such loathsome calumnies is evidence as to the wonderful patience of Southern whites." These papers also began to promote the lost cause narrative taking hold across the South. The Confederate veteran wrote in 1906, "The kindliest relation that ever existed between the two races in this country, or that ever will, was the antebellum relation of master and slave, a relation of confidence and responsibility on the part of the master, and of dependence and fidelity on the part of the slave." That same paper wrote 5 years later in 1911, "The African, coming from a barbarous state and from a tropical climate, could not meet the demands for skilled labor in the factories of the northern states, neither could he endure the severe cold of the northern winter. For these reasons it was both merciful and business to sell him to the southern planter. where the climate was more favorable and skilled labor not so important. In the South, the climate, civilization, and other influences ameliorated the African's condition, and that of almost the entire race of slaves, which numbered into the millions before their emancipation. It should be noted that their evangelization was the most fruitful missionary work of any modern Christian endeavor. The thoughtful and considerate Negro of today realizes his indebtedness to the institution of African slavery for advantages which he would not have received had he remained in his semi-barbarism, waiting in his native jungles for the delayed missionary. And still today, apologists use certain other alleged reasons for the war. The most popular reason given is that the war was really about states' rights. It is true that at the core of the conflict wasn't so much about the morality of slavery, though that was certainly central for many, but rather the economic system of the South which thrived on it and political control of that system. And in that sense, the conflict referenced states' rights. Slavery was integral to the South's economy, which is why they resisted any change in that system as opposed to any number of other issues that also involved states' rights, but which they simply debated as usual in Congress without threats of secession. It was only this specific issue that raised the South to war. People will maintain and justify by strange rationalization all kinds of evil when their pocketbooks are on the line. Also at the core of the argument was Western expansion. The South wanted to take slavery into new Western territories, while the North resisted that attempt. The Republican Party was staunchly opposed to the idea of expanding slavery beyond its existing borders in the South, and the election of Abraham Lincoln without any votes from Southern states was proof positive that their influence on the issue had been lost. It was his election that all but sealed the fate of the Civil War with secession. In fact, this desire to expand slavery into new non-state territories, not states' rights, was more consequential than anything. Would new territories be admitted as states with slavery or not? Not only that, but in their own new Constitution, the Confederacy prevented any of its states from outlawing slavery within its borders. They were more than happy to ignore states' rights when it suited them. Before secession, Southern states were unhappy with Northern states refusing to allow the transit of slaves and would not return escaped slaves to the South. Some of them, in their own state constitutions, even prevented future legislation from outlawing slavery, removing from their current and past condition the rights of states to do as they pleased with the issue in their own sovereign territory. This alone is proof positive that states' rights was simply a rallying cry. The actual purpose was to maintain white supremacy, preventing states from having the right to emancipate their slaves at any time. Some say the war was about taxes. There was no federal income tax at the time of the Civil War. Export tariff rates were also at their lowest rate since 1816, with special consideration and rate reductions given to Southern states. Money was, of course, involved, but not related to taxation. The threat to the economic foundation of the South built upon slavery was made clear by Mississippi and Alabama in their declarations of secession, as earlier cited. The South's economy was booming at the time with taxation at an all-time low, including both imports and exports. Still others asked that if the war was really about slavery, why did Southern men who didn't own slaves bother to fight? It was simply what was expected of them. Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest said, "I've got no respect for a young man who won't join the colors." This was the prevailing attitude in the South. They were expected to fight, regardless of their beliefs. The fact that many didn't own slaves had nothing to do with their support for it. History is full of warfare and battlefields piled with the bodies of soldiers who either had no idea what they were really fighting for, simply doing what was expected in their prevailing culture. Slavery didn't magically disappear overnight with the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't just go away with the end of the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment on December 18, 1865, officially outlawing slavery in the United States. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed, allowing the federal government to protect the civil rights of all, including African Americans, but nothing that endemic to a culture simply fades away immediately. It takes a very long time. much longer than the mere 157 years since the end of the war. That time is but a blink to historians, barely enough for even small changes to occur. If they couldn't have slavery, the South would do anything and everything it could to maintain white superiority. And they did exactly that, and continue to do so. They simply began to codify oppression and make it systemic. They lashed out against Reconstruction, and this brings us to Jim Crow. Paramilitary and what we would today call terrorist organizations, such as the KKK beginning in the 1860s, had risen in southern states, the militias of their time that looked much like the private militias of today. Slowly but surely, white Democrats regained control of southern state legislatures and had total control by 1877. Republicans were violently attacked, chased out of towns, and voter suppression and fraud were extensive to keep them from office. In fact, there was a successful insurrection in Wilmington, North Carolina, in 1898 in which white supremacists literally wrested control of the government and took over. These new legislatures were known as Redeemer governments, and they began passing what have come to be known as Jim Crow laws to keep the black population in poverty and separated from whites. Segregation began to become law, enforcing that separation with the separate but equal doctrine. Blacks were kept off ballots, literacy tests were required to vote, while blacks who were forced to go to underfunded schools and libraries, and poll taxes were applied to ensure that those of low income would not be able to vote at all. Violence and intimidation were used if other measures failed. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education that segregation, at least officially, came to an end. The rallying cry for Southern legislatures being forced to stop discriminating against black Americans was, you guessed it, states' rights. The same argument used to maintain slavery was being used a century later to maintain white supremacy and segregation. It took until 1967 for the Supreme Court to rule that anti-miscegenation laws allowing interracial marriage, were unconstitutional. And finally, in 1971, busing segregation was ruled unconstitutional. This was over a century after the end of the Civil War. That's how long it took to address and do away with Southern attempts to maintain black oppression without slavery. In fact, religion played a large role, even from the judicial bench. Judge Leon Bazile was on a lower court and heard the case of Loving v. Virginia on interracial marriage before it reached the Supreme Court. He said, Almighty God created the races white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and placed them on separate continents, and but for the interference with his arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend the races to mix. Through the 1970s, realtors and neighborhood groups entered what were called racial covenants, keeping blacks out of many areas not by force of law, but by private homeowner agreements. The covenants stated, said premises shall not be rented, leased, or conveyed to, or occupied by any person other than of the white or Caucasian race. From 1865 to 1970, it took first a war and amendments to outlaw slavery, enforcement of those amendments to prevent states and localities from continuing oppression through segregation, and finally outlawing private groups from trying to keep Jim Crow alive without law. When all else failed, it simply continued with the proverbial wink and nod. Blacks were kept out of jobs with any number of excuses being provided other than their color. They were kept out of better housing because of poor credit histories and financial standing, which had been built into the system for over a century and kept them in that place. Now they could be oppressed legally, using excuses that could be provided for any race, but always seemed to target only them. Fighting this took new tactics and much more time, which is why it still continues today, and it has been fought every step of the way. This is the part of a fight that is hardest and takes the longest, the attempt to finally shift a culture from its long thinking, that which is endemic to it. The culture has indeed been changing, and those who would oppress black people are finding themselves in a larger and larger minority, even among whites. They have gotten louder and ever more dangerous, even carrying the flags of another enemy, not the Confederacy, but Nazi ideology, with the flags of a nation that murdered millions of people as we lost so many of our own brave soldiers fighting against that ideology. Fox News, OAN, and other conservative outlets and figures call those rioting against racial oppression violent thugs, while declaring insurrectionists who violently attacked our Capitol on January 6th peaceful protesters. The Republican Party literally issued a statement censuring Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, calling the insurrection legitimate political discussion. Violence on their behalf is peaceful protest, but for anything with which they disagree is thuggish and unacceptable, as they scream for law and order. Those arguing that the Civil War was about anything other than slavery at its core are not arguing with you. They're not arguing with me. They're not arguing with anyone in our time. They are arguing with the South at that time, the states who seceded and made clear the reason for their secession, those state constitutions after secession, the Southern politicians and influencers who repeated that cause over and over again, the words of the soldiers themselves, newspapers representing prevailing Southern sentiment, and even religious Southern leaders during the Civil War. If you can, get into a time machine, go back, try to convince them that their own stated causes were untrue, and you'd really appreciate it if they'd stop that and make your life easier today by giving you a little ground to stand on. Absent that, you are simply factually incorrect and trying to exclude from Civil War culture Civil War Southern culture that which largely defined it, slavery. I want to speak for a moment to heritage and continuing cultural influence. There seems to be an either-or problem among those proud of their Southern heritage. Either slavery was a huge problem or not as bad as suggested and your heritage is pure, or slavery was an enormous problem and evil and your heritage is irreparably stained. This is a false dichotomy. There are plenty of things to be proud of in Southern heritage and culture, and it is also true that much of what made the culture able to thrive and prosper was slavery. The operative word is and. Both things are true. Recognizing that slavery was the cause of the Civil War and a massive contributor to what allowed Southern culture to grow does not eliminate those things about the culture which you can be proud of. The South was far from the only culture in the history of the world to incorporate slavery on a large scale while having influence far beyond its own time and existence. The cultures of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, the Byzantine Empire, and various medieval cultures in Western and Northern Europe and a world away in Arabic countries all had slaves and even many laws about them. Slavery was bad then just as it's bad today. There is no time or context in which owning other human beings as property was or is acceptable. However, all of those cultures and civilizations have had enduring influence also in a number of positive ways. Ancient Rome, for example, would not have been as wildly successful as it was without slavery. The same is true of the Civil War South. It being so much closer to our own time, its cultural endurance is much more palpable. Reaction to it is more pronounced. There is a gentility and general politeness in Southern culture, conjuring the image of sitting on the front porch of a plantation, sipping lemonade, having whiskey, and sharing the gossip of the day. The South had more rural areas than the North. Outdoor activities like hunting and fishing were big parts of the culture and remain so today. A warm attachment to such images and the heritage they represent is perfectly fine. However, do not do so without remembering that the beverages were being served by house slaves, and the plantation grounds were being kept and maintained by slaves. The fields that produced the crops making the plantation thrive and prosper were worked by slaves. Slaves carried hunting and fishing gear, fetched down prey, cleaned the fish, and served their masters. There are things of which you can be proud, but also important lessons to be learned. In the same breath that you thank your ancestors for the heritage they gave you, also remember to thank those slaves who made it possible and recognize that it was still very, very wrong. Don't get stuck in a false dichotomy that tempts you to become an apologist trying to jettison that evil from our history. There remain many today who actually do believe in white superiority and think of slavery with fondness as something that should still exist, saying the same things they did back then, that it preserves white equality and that blacks are somehow inferior and need to be taken care of. Many still use religion as a proper reason. These are people with whom I cannot argue, because it's pointless. They are wanting in character and don't deserve my time. Our founders had to address slavery, ultimately retaining it in a deal with the devil, contradicting the ideal they themselves espoused in our Declaration of Independence and the Constitution they ratified to form a new nation. They pushed the issue off to future generations, resulting in a costly and bloody war, pitting relatives and friends against each other. Southern politicians, religious leaders, and newspapers saw that conflict coming and began to build sentiment for secession, dwelling on slavery and white superiority as natural, necessary, and right. Even during the war, they left no doubt, from the senator on the floor to the soldier on the battlefield, that the fight was about slavery, holding on to that after the war had come to an end. Before, during, and after the Civil War, they knew their cause, finally calling it a lost cause. How they felt, what they believed, and what they fought for, in their own words, provides abundant evidence as to their motivation and cause: slavery, and slavery alone. As noted, that fight continues to this day, as those who recall that history with a twisted sense of fondness wish to see it revived in any way they can. The 4 years of Trump's presidency, and now continuing a year after, the winks and nods continue as we now see a division driving as deeply and strongly as it did then. We're never far from where we were.